Hello, welcome to the Kaizen Show, where we explore the little things that help create the big things. I'm your host, Mac Kennedy, the founder and head coach at Kaizen Triathlon Academy. On today's show, we have Nick Jankovskis of Nick's at Mets Performance. He's a sports scientist, exercise sports scientist, but I guess today we're exploring what that is and how it helps contribute to the success of our athletes. So Nick, welcome to the Kaizen Show.
No, good to have me. Glad to be here and keen to have a chat.
So how about you tell us what is a sports scientist and how it contributes to the success of our athletes?
Yeah, so I guess in terms of sports science, it's a pretty broad industry, right? So there's all sorts of different areas. I mainly specialise in the physiology pathway. So looking at energy systems, how the body works internally to generate outputs, but then you've obviously got the biomechanics path, which from a triathlon cycling sense is more your bike fitting, aerodynamic sort of space. There's the motor learning skill acquisition space, which for those who are familiar with like a Paul McKinnon balance runner, like talk about run technique. So there's all these different paths. So really what we're doing as sports scientists or in that field of sports science is problem solving and trying to find ways to improve an athlete's performance, whether that be through any or all of those paths connected at one. It's really trying to optimize and find how can we find an extra 1 or 2% for the pro and elite, but ultimately then when we translate it to amateurs, recreational athletes, like how can we find 10 or 15% in their performance? So it really does come down to just how do we problem solve to make someone a better athlete overall.
I certainly wanted to explore that more, but I guess I want to have a little look into Nick and his journey into becoming a sports scientist and as an athlete, because not everyone listening is a professional athlete. And I guess give us a bit of a background in terms of your journey as an athlete. Being an AFL umpire, you've got to be fairly fit as well. So I guess in terms of for you, what's been your journey and what does success look like for you?
Yeah, so I guess it is sort of an interesting career that I've sort of taken where I work kind of on both sides of the fence. Like the sports science side, obviously I've always loved sport and been passionate about sport, and always knew I wanted to work in it in some capacity. I guess all of us when we're kids probably want to be a professional athlete at some point in time, or most who are probably listening to this would be. But I sort of worked out pretty early that I wasn't going to play AFL. I wasn't going to be good enough to play cricket for Australia, or like I enjoyed sports, but I wasn't necessarily elite at some of those. But fell into the umpiring path, and that's where I really got my opportunity to live out that bit of a dream as an elite athlete. But then along the way, I mean, it's a very different path to when I say being an athlete. The difference between sort of an AFL footballer and then an umpire's pathway, ours is a much longer journey to get to the top. So you've got to go and work and do something in the meantime to help pay the bills and work your way through that as a career. So I knew that working in sport performance side, I could still work with the top end in whatever sport that might be, but then also still pursue a career in umpiring on the side. So they kind of worked, I guess, across the journey hand in hand. From a sports science sense, it was after school, went to uni, undergrad degree in sports science, eventually went on to do my master's in high performance sport. And at the same time was building that umpiring career through local footy, working up into the VFL, spent about 6 or 7 years at the VFL, and then the last couple of years been fortunate enough to run around on the big grounds in the AFL. So that really they have quite, they've sort of mirrored each other in a really interesting way, but I guess there's a lot of crossover too. Like the things I've learnt as a sports scientist have really helped my own physical performance, obviously, and helped build the connections to be able to improve myself as an athlete. But then the things that I've learnt in terms of the umpiring journey to be a better decision maker, critical thinker, work under intense pressure, that's really helped work back in the workplace where it's like, I don't necessarily have to make a decision in half a second here. I've got some time to think through a process and work through it. That's what we do on field umpiring wise. But so realistically, there's a heap of crossover. And I've been really fortunate that I've been able to build both careers at the same time. Umpiring is a pretty demanding, particularly at AFL level. It's quite time intensive and demanding, travel involved, etc. But to be able to still have something outside of footy and work in the same high performance sporting environment's been really cool.
In terms of lab testing, what does a day look like for a sports scientist? Have we got lab coats on? Are we doing anything crazy?
Not quite. We bin the lab coats pretty quickly. Luke and I were not keen on wearing lab coats and big safety glasses and stuff from the jump. But yeah, I guess as I mentioned earlier, like sports science is really broad. So where we've specialised at Mets is the physiology part. And really, I guess the premise of our lab as a bit of background for those who haven't seen us or haven't come into the lab is we really wanted to focus on how can we bring the same physiological testing and performance science that the elites have, or someone who might have a VIS or AIS contract have, to those who don't. So whether that's amateur recreational athletes or whether that is professional athletes in long course triathlon who aren't funded, government funded, they're not an Olympic program, they've got to do it on their own. So what that then looks like for us is most of our specialty is in things like VO2 max testing. We do a lot of metabolic analysis to look at fuel utilization, fat versus carbohydrate use. We look at a lot of lactate profiling. I was mentioning just off air, it's like we've taken so many lactate samples over the years, it's ridiculous. To then build out things like training zones and understand intensity regulation for athletes a bit better. How can we then take all of this data in the end and apply it to a training program? And that's the ultimate part that's going to make an athlete better. Like, you can do as much testing as you like, and we've always sort of, I guess, semi-joked internally about, like, realistically in the lab, if you had enough time with the equipment, you could run a test. Like, anyone could run a test using the equipment if you know which buttons to press. But it's the breakdown of that data and implementation to the program that's the key bit. Like, the lab part's the cool part, but it's like the athlete's still got to go away and do the work. But what work are they doing? Are they doing the right things? Are they doing enough high intensity? Are they doing enough low intensity? Are they staying low enough in a heart rate in those low intensity sessions? Like, that complexity comes from what we find in the data, but you don't get that without that front end process. So typical day in the lab will be mainly lab testing. A lot of them break down the data afterwards to just double check things, have a look through and see if I can find anything else that I haven't initially found. Comparing, a great example was last night, had an athlete in who, amateur marathon runner, came in October last year, come back in to retest, to reassess for the next couple of months. So a lot of that discussion was comparison. It's like, what has improved and what hasn't? How has that training program actually been effective, or maybe did it miss the mark in certain aspects? So it's a pretty broad summary, but then we get all sorts of athletes in too, and that, I guess that builds the complexity, right? Like, an amateur athlete who's never run before, who wants to go and build up to their first 5K park run. We get that level all the way through to multi-time Olympian, professional long course triathlete. Grace has come in before, who was on the first episode. But we get such a spectrum of different abilities and levels, and that then is a bit of a challenge in itself of understanding what can we extract from those bits of data that's actually going to find the improvement. Because for some it will be 1%, but some will be 10 or 15.
And I certainly want to come to that in terms of the differences between the elite athletes, the professionals, the likes of Grace, and the weekend warriors, as we might sort of say. But I guess I want to come back a little bit to the sports science, to those who don't understand, because you do metabolic testing, you check body composition, you're checking VO2 max, whatever that is, lactate testing, just to simplify it for those who don't understand sports science. What is it essentially that you are looking for, and how do we then utilize that to improve as athletes?
Yeah, so I guess it really comes down to a handful of key metrics. Obviously, VO2 max is kind of the buzz termy one that a lot of people look at. This would be probably slightly controversial, but as someone who looks at VO2 max for a living, like, that's probably one of my least concerns half the time. You can have a really high VO2 max, but if you can't output it in terms of speed, in terms of wattage, comparative, like, it's kind of useless. Like, you could have a VO2 max of 75, 80, 85, 90, and if you're only running at 5-minute K pace to achieve that, like, you're not going to run very fast in a marathon, for example. So, like, obviously that does give us an insight in terms of how we use oxygen, though. So, I mean, something like VO2 max, we're looking at the maximum amount of oxygen you can take in, transport, and use in 1 minute. At a top-end capability, well, if we know you've got a really, really big-size engine, well, I've probably got some scope to be able to move things within that engine. How can we sort of lift up maybe the economy side of things? So actually minimising your oxygen consumption to make you more sustainable, or more a greater endurance or durability sort of capability. And then from a metabolic sort of profile, it's, as I briefly mentioned earlier, like, the fuel utilization piece is key. Like, how good are you at utilizing fats or carbohydrates, or what is that split, becomes really important for something like, I'll use marathon again, but for an amateur marathon runner who wants to run a 3-hour marathon, if you do it with no fuel, I can guarantee you're going to run out at some point. Like, most athletes will have 90 minutes to 2 hours worth of stored carbohydrate that you can probably get away with not taking anything in. You're going to start feeling the pinch by the end of that, but we've still got an extra hour and a half in the race to go. So understanding what's the proportion of carbohydrate versus fat at that particular race intensity, what does that then mean in terms of how much we need to put back in? Is your current strategy enough? Like, is putting 60 grams of carbs an hour okay for you as it may be a smaller, leaner athlete? Or maybe you're actually expending a bit more carbohydrate than you thought, and a strategy of 75, 80, 85 grams an hour plus, and we start talking about long course triathlon of guys doing 120, 140 grams an hour on the bike. Like, all of that can come from the data that we collect to just refine and adjust some of those external strategies. And this is where the complexity of sports science comes in, because we might talk about something in the lab around, all right, we need to try and, we're looking at maybe from a fueling perspective, we either need to try to find a way to get more carbohydrates back in because you're burning it so excessively, or we need to find a way to minimize your output. On the bike, that might be, hey, actually go see the bike fitter and the biomechanist to improve your aerodynamics so we can drop your 30 watts on the bike for the same speed. Now you're actually burning less carbohydrate. Now we can have a bit of a flow-on effect. So it really is just taking all of this data and just, I guess, navigating for the individual what is going to give us that little bit of a performance edge. But then within that, it's also being realistic with what the capabilities of that individual are right now. A good example would be most amateur runners want to try and break 3 hours as a marathon. There is a handful of data points that I tend to look for that if you can tick those off in a lab test, like, you're pretty likely going to get close to the 3 hour mark. If you're nowhere near it in the lab testing, 3 hours is going to be a pretty big challenge. So you then have to work with the reality side of things and also get athletes to sort of understand like where they're at. It's just a snapshot of time now. Here's the process to improve to get to maybe a point you want to get to. But it's sort of that balance of like, yes, we can optimize, but you can also only optimize so far. At this point in time, it might take a long period of time to adjust a few things to really boost them up.
And historically, when we talk about testing in sport, a lot of it's actually generally been around men. And then, so there's definitely a lack of testing around women. I imagine today in your lab, you're getting a little more of an even split, and if not, you can correct me. But also, what do you see in terms of the differences between men and women? Because just before you were talking about that utilization of fat, and men certainly aren't as optimized to burning fat as women are. Mm-hmm. What are you seeing in terms of the differences, and are we progressing when it comes to testing women and increasing their performance as well?
Yeah, I think the first point, there's definitely still a bias, and like this isn't an intentional bias, but like just what we've seen over the 7-8 years worth of testing that we've done so far is like there are more males that come through the lab than females. That's just kind of the reality of what we see. We've tried a few things, even sort of marketing wise, every now and then, and for whatever reason, there's a greater male participation. Part of that is, as a whole, endurance sports, you look at the size of the male fields versus the size of the female fields. Often it's quite big, like quite a lot bigger. I've always had a bit of a theory in some of those categories that are quite smaller, where it's like, if you're winning everything, like as a female athlete, if you're going and dominating your category by quite a bit in terms of an age group race, like how much more do you actually need to refine and keep doing until maybe someone comes along and knocks you off? So there may be a little bit of that subconsciously. It's a guess, but yeah, I mean, it's still very male dominant. A lot of the research you're right, like has historically always been males. There's not as much female participation. There's more coming, and it will eventually get to a point where we've got a lot more data. But I guess in terms of what we see, the major things that we see are around like the obvious stuff. Typically VO2 max isn't as high, typically not producing the same top end in terms of wattages or absolute wattage outputs on the bike. Running speeds tend to be a touch lower. I mean, that's all stuff that for years and years and years we've got evidence to suggest like that's always going to happen to an extent on average. Not always the case. Obviously, our elite females will beat out some of our amateur males, etc. Like that's a level of training thing. But then, yeah, fat oxidation is a really interesting one. Like often you'll see, more often than not, female athletes are much better at utilising fat as a fuel source than males. Not always the case though. We've had some of the females come through who are a little bit higher carbohydrate use, and whether that's maybe their dietary intervention, how they've trained, what sporting background they've come from. I mean, you take any athlete who's come from a much more explosive, faster paced environment, 1500 metre runner, for example, very glycolytic, very carbohydrate heavy intensity, and try and get them to go run an ultra marathon straight away. Like they're going to struggle with that fat oxidation compared to someone who's been doing ultras for 10, 15, 20 years. So part of that will come into the training aspect, and maybe a bit of genetics. But yeah, often what you'll see is females tend to be a little bit better at using fat as a fuel source. But then it's this case of, some of those extra complexities around how they've trained. On an even scale of, like, if you just take an athlete who's done, say, 20 hours a week versus 10 hours a week on average for 5 years, it's like, regardless of if they're male or female, I'm probably backing in that 20-hour athlete more often than not in, like, an amateur race or wherever it might be. So there's a few things there that almost doesn't matter. But it's interesting that, like, now with, like, things like ultra running really sort of growing, you're now starting to see that progress a bit more. Like, you're starting to see some of the female athletes actually do really quite well comparatively. And there's always been a bit of that theory that maybe they'll actually be the better ultra runners potentially, like, longer term. But again, participation wise, you go, like, once the talent pool's there, like, everything starts to expand a bit. If the talent pool's not quite there, there's not many doing it compared to the men. It's like, well, you're always going to have maybe one exceptional athlete, but you look at any sport where there's big participation, like, those top end standouts really sort of shine. It's like, if you boosted the female participation rates in ultra running 100-fold, like, you'd probably actually find some of the girls would really take it up to them.
Yeah, I have my theories around participation numbers in triathlon. I think it's about a 70-30 split in terms of being more male dominant, and it's been fairly like that for quite a while. I think we're starting to get a little more even numbers when it comes to marathon running, and I think a lot of it does come down to time. If they're having kids and spending time at home, and I think there's a more guilt factor with women needing to, well, not needing to, but wanting to spend that time at home with their kids. I think men tend to I'm not sure what the correct term is, but they certainly spend more time invested in their training. So it's probably up to us men supporting our partners to make sure that they can get out there and do the training necessary for them to perform on race day. Having to think over all the people that you have coming to the labs, which I think now would be in the thousands. And you've probably done not hundreds of thousands, but a lot of lactate tests. And you think about the athletes you have, because you have had professional athletes in the lab, and you have had people that are looking to more or less complete a marathon their first time. What would you say are some of the similarities between the professionals and the age groupers and what they're looking for in the lab, and what are those contributing factors that will help them get the most out of their testing?
Yeah, I think in terms of similarities, like, if we look at on the outset, numbers-wise, they're going to be different. So, like, heart rates will be different, pace will be different, but setting up really accurate training zones is the commonality across pretty much every athlete that comes in. And the reason for that is through lab testing, we can really clearly identify, a lot of people might have heard of lactate threshold 1, lactate threshold 2. But ultimately what we're trying to do there is just set up some really clear intensity boundaries to go, all right, you're going to go out and train 10 hours a week. What do we need in terms of your endurance event? Maybe it's a marathon. Elite marathon runner's going to have to do a lot of Ks. Amateur marathon runner's going to have to do a lot of Ks. Most of that is going to be at a relatively easy intensity, because it's just not sustainable to go as hard as you can every day, day in, day out, hours and hours and hours on end. So what does that look like? Well, for the amateur and the professional, they're trying to identify where that first threshold is, and that first little change in something like blood lactate. We also get some ventilation metrics behind that, to then set up, okay, when I'm going and doing my easy run, what's the heart rate I need to stick to or below? What's the range I'm looking for to be more optimally in, to keep me in that zone? What does that mean from a pace perspective? What does that maybe mean from the fueling I might need in some of those longer sessions to help me back up for day in, day out? That's all similar. It's just the shift relative to professionals going to be running a hell of a lot quicker typically than someone who's signing up for their first marathon and hasn't done much running. Same for then the second threshold. It's like knowing where that second threshold sits is an important characteristic for then any of that sort of middle intensity running. Much more specific if you're looking at like 5 and 10K, but then definitely for like where does a tempo run sit if you're going to try and build for a half marathon? That's quite a specific intensity at that point. Within that though is the pros and faster or better an athlete you are heading up to that sort of pro spectrum, things do start to change in terms of your capability. So as a pro athlete, most of the top end guys that we see would be able to run half marathons at maybe even a tiny bit above their threshold. The typical amateur's running a 10K purely just on speed output. So in terms of what we then refer to as what those thresholds mean, like then that's where it can deviate. But both of those types of athlete are still trying to identify where that is, so they've got an understanding of where it sits within the whole big picture. And I mean, that's really what we're trying to do. And we're just trying to give athletes of all levels that full piece of, like, full look at the puzzle to go, all right, what are the missing pieces in it? Where can we make some of those tweaks and adjustments? So there will be similarities, and the types of information they're looking for is quite similar, but then it just becomes really relevant to the individual and what that actually means in the field when they go out and run, ride, swim, whatever it might be.
Yeah. And threshold is probably a term that us coaches use a lot and gets used a lot in sport. What does it mean scientifically? Is it a measure of what's happening in the blood? Is it something that's happening in terms of percentage of the VO2 max? What is this term threshold that's constantly getting used and probably, in your view, possibly isn't getting enough clarity around because people might think it's 80% or 70% or give us a bit of a rundown of what that actually is.
That's probably the exact problem. So what I mean by that is, like, from a scientific perspective, like threshold, the term threshold gets thrown around, but it's like, how do you define it, right? You could ask, we could line up 20 different sports scientists from around the world and just ask them the question, what is threshold? And you'd probably end up with at least 10 different answers, maybe 12. Like, there'd be some similarities and depending where they went with it, because there's so many terms. Like, if you look through the literature over years and years and years, there's references to lactate threshold, anaerobic threshold, like maximal lactate steady state's another methodology of getting there. You can look at ventilatory threshold, so scrap the lactate piece, look at ventilation only. And then there's the practical side of, like, when people start talking about functional threshold. It's like, well, what does that kind of mean? For the broadest side of things, from my observation, and I guess I get to sit in a really nice position of when I'm sitting in the lab, I have athletes who work with all sorts of different coaches, all sorts of different backgrounds. They've done their own reading. They've just blindly followed a coach's thought process, like whatever it might be, whether it's right or wrong. I get all this info of, like, what people are referring to. The common theme for me of what most people understand threshold is, it's an intensity where roughly you can hold it for about 40 to 60-ish minutes for most recreational amateur sort of level athletes, or it's the intensity they're thinking about when they think about that time frame. Physiologically, it's often what we then associate with, well, where are you starting to fatigue a little bit more? So my best description to cover all of those terminology semantics bits is, once you go above threshold, you're going to start fatiguing quite quickly and you'll start feeling it. So you can think about this in a practical setting of, if you just ramped up speed progressively on a treadmill, which is what we do in the lab, but if you did that on your own to try and work out roughly where it is, you'll start getting to a point where you're like, oh yeah, legs are starting to feel it a bit here. Go back a level on the treadmill. That was probably your threshold where you cross that point. Below that threshold, metabolically, like, you should be fatiguing relatively slowly. At some point you will fatigue. Like, we can't run endlessly forever. But that's kind of that balance point. And I guess where that then matches up with some of the things we measure is your lactate threshold. That lactate threshold too, we're often looking for this big, rapid rise in lactate beyond that point. And that's one of those indicators for us of, clearly there's more fatigue starting to accumulate in the system. Lactate itself isn't fatiguing. We'll cover that off quickly there. It's like, it's other processes that we're measuring lactate because it's easy to measure, but it's things going on in the background as a result of that accumulating.
Which is what I was just going to clarify, is the fatigue versus I'm getting tired. I'm feeling like maybe it's a lack of training, lack of conditioning. E.g., if I'm used to running 5K, I'm now running a 10K, 8-9Ks in, I'm going to feel fatigued because it's a loading that I'm not used to.
Yep.
But what's happening in terms of the blood, the lactate, like if I went all out and did 1K effort, there's a different level of fatigue there. So can you help explain the fatigue of the lack of maybe conditioning and the fatigue of this lactate thing?
Yeah, so I guess, like, just on that sort of threshold thought, I mean, we're talking about, for most people, it's that 40 to 60 odd minutes. So even within your point there of, I mean, some people will run for 40 minutes and be like pretty much at that threshold, and because of how they've trained, like, they'd actually have 60 minutes in the tank. So they go into a 10K. Like, if you're a 35-minute 10K, you're probably running slightly above threshold because of the duration of the event. It's going to be quite fatiguing. You'll feel it pinch a bit. If you're a 60-minute 10K, like, you're actually probably running just maybe sub your threshold. So the training aspect comes in there. I guess in terms of this, like, this lactate thing, right? The higher the intensity you hold, the more of a glycolytic component. So as intensity goes from resting all the way to as hard as you can possibly go, there's this gradual ramping in more and more carbohydrate use, which is more and more of a what we call a glycolytic pathway, breakdown of glycogen, glucose, carbohydrate fundamentally. But the faster we go, the quicker the energy requirement. So we need energy really rapidly when we're working hard. You do a flat out 1K, it's like, yeah, am I maximally sprinting as fast as I can, like 100-meter pace? No, but I'm working pretty bloody hard. Like, it might take you 3 minutes, might take you 3.5, might take you 2.5 minutes, depending how fast you are, etc. But there's a need for more energy more quickly. The downside of that is you have to pay a bit of a consequence. So when we break down glucose or glycogen as a carbohydrate, the first thing that happens is it gets smashed really quick and we get an initial release of energy. There is going to be some leftover. I always describe this in the lab to those who have no idea sports science-wise as like, what are we, February now, so a couple months till Easter. Get a giant Easter egg, you smash it on a table, there's a piece that you can eat straight away. That's your usable energy. You'll get it straight away. I haven't really had to put much work into it. I smash it really quick, great. There's some big chunks left over. That's kind of like lactate, right? So if you just left it there, there'd be some big chunks left over that eventually, with time and internally in the body with aerobic processes and oxygen, etc., we can break that down further and use that as energy. So you can break those bigger chunks into smaller pieces. At low intensity, that's great because you can have as much time as you like. When the intensity's on though, the quickest way to do it is smash one Easter egg, grab a bite, smash the next Easter egg, grab a bite, and so you've got all this residual left over. That's your lactate accumulating. We just don't have time in the moment to mop it up or utilize oxygen to break it down further to get the rest of it in. So it'll just sit there until it is used, fundamentally. What then, I guess, happens though is like, it's not just those two parts. You smash the Easter egg, you get a piece you can eat, you get a bit left over, there's your lactate. There's those tiny, annoying little splinters of chocolate that come off when you smash an Easter egg. That's often what we refer to as things like hydrogens. Like, that's the fatiguing, burning part you feel in the legs. You can't do anything with it. It's the annoying little bit that, like, I can't eat. It's not going to give me any energy. It's a tiny bit of the Easter egg, though. It's just splintered off, and as those accumulate, as you keep smashing more Easter eggs, that's the fatiguing part. But it's all got to do with how quickly you're getting the energy. Like, if I need energy quickly, if I want to run a flat out 1K, I need it now. I don't have time for air to get into my lungs, get into the blood, oxygen to get into the bloodstream, transport down to the muscles, politely break down some carbohydrate molecules really neatly and mop everything up. It's like, no, I need the energy now, but I'm going to pay a consequence, which again is why you run a flat out 1K, yeah, you're going to start feeling the burn pretty quickly. Like, you might get 600 meters in, it's like, yeah, legs are hurting, but I can hang on for 400 and tolerate it for a bit. If you tried to keep that same speed up for 42Ks, you'd struggle pretty quick because it's just like, at some point, I can't keep up with all this excess. Legs are really burning, you're going to get some heavy sort of muscular fatigue at that point. We can't keep up the rate of energy production. Something's going to have to give, and often what that means is athletes start slowing down. Part of that process is going to be, it's going to buy you time to get more oxygen in, allow you to utilize that oxygen a bit more effectively, clear some of that lactate, and now we can set off and go again. But consequence, energy production then is not as quick, intensity has to drop. Hopefully that's not a weird analogy, but I think it works quite nicely in terms of like explaining in a really like simple way how that process works. Because if you actually look, you open up a physiological textbook, there's all sorts of these very complicated processes of how we actually break down carbohydrate or glucose, if you like. It's a very, very complicated system. It's one that most people just won't even really ever get their heads around. It takes a long period of time, but there's so many steps to it. But I think about it in a way like that, where it's like, more energy quicker, we're going to pay the price, really. And so I guess that leads to the point of, we're always going to have this sort of pace or power duration relationship. Like, you want to go really hard, unfortunately you can't do it for a long period of time. You want to go really easy, you can do it as long as you like. And there's this sort of curve aspect that builds out. And I guess over the years of working in the lab and working with a bunch of different athletes, like, that theme for me has always then kept presenting itself as being a really important part of how an athlete operates, is this relationship between, well, what can you do for 5 minutes versus what can you do for 10, what can you do for an hour, 3 hours, etc. Like, as we shift and move things across that curve, yeah, we can start to make some improvements, but you have to stick to the principles of that, because the body's not going to allow you to run 1K pace forever. So
I feel like one of the big things for professional athletes compared to those that aren't elite athletes is possibly even their understanding of that information. For those who are now getting into lab testing now, it kind of feels like the days of when we started getting power meters in bikes. We get a whole pile of information, we get these tools, and then we don't actually have any idea what to do with it. I'm sort of an old school athlete and coach where go by feel, and I feel like that's the best starting point. And when you have an understanding of how you feel and then bring in the data to support that information, you're going to be in a good stead to then be able to progress forward with that information. Otherwise, you can do a whole pile of testing, you can get the tools, but have no idea what you're doing with it. It's sort of like, I want to build a house and get all these tools and go, right, now what do I do with it? It might seem simple enough that you can grab a hammer and a nail, but if you just start banging away, there's a good chance you're not going to be, building what you want to create. So if you, as an athlete, wanted to utilize the lab, probably part of that is actually just understanding that level of information that you're going to get and simplifying it down of, okay, what key things we're looking for to help us progress forward as an athlete. And you've obviously read a lot more than I have. We can look at the Jack Daniels measurements. You got the Norwegian method. There's 3 zones, there's 5 zones, there's 7 zones, there's 7A and B. You would have seen all the different measurements. How do we simplify it down for those who haven't got a full understanding of the complexities of that? How do we keep it simple and go, okay, this is the things that I'm looking for, and how do we then bring that into, this is what it feels like for, e.g., I'm reaching lactate, I'm reaching, help us understand or understand that.
Yeah, I think you're definitely spot on in terms of like how experienced you are definitely will play into what then you look for. Those who have a lot of training, racing experience are often probably a little bit better at knowing what things feel like, what should and shouldn't be happening at certain distances, events, etc. And that can really guide what we discuss in lab. Those who come in who have no idea, and some of them are really, in a great way, really quite honest, man, like, I have no idea what I'm doing. Lay it out for me. Best way I sort of look at it is, well, the most simplistic system is the 3-zone system, and that's what often a lot of the training intensity distribution, aka how much hard stuff, how much middles ground, and how much easy stuff do you do across a week. Most of that research is always in that 3-zone system because it's an easy model to apply to a lot of different circumstances. But I think that's really the philosophy that we've always worked off is for those who, well, we always base all of our stuff off, assume that everyone doesn't know anything. So when they first come to the lab, I actually don't know half the time what someone's background is until we have a conversation with them before the test. So I just make the assumption that it's like they have zero sports science knowledge. Let's start at that level. And then as we work through that conversation, I get an understanding of, okay, what level can we start talking to, or what zone system have they used before, what are they familiar with, and how can I adjust and sort of navigate that. But as a base level, like that 3-zone system is really easy setup. It's like zone 1 being all your easy stuff below the first lactate threshold, which most people can then understand once they've had that test. Ultimately, the data's there. It's like you were 1.5 and now you're 2.6. Okay, like it was pretty clear that we saw an increase in lactate occur there. What I do like to do, though, is then match that up with things like rating a perceived exertion. So really simple on the test. I don't do this necessarily all the time for every athlete, but when I think it makes a really important difference to their understanding of that data is go through the test, and after each stage, after we take each incremental lactate measurement, just ask them a simple scale of 0 to 10. I know there's different thoughts on should you use 0 to 10, should you use 6 to 20. That's discussion for another time. But I don't think that really matters. It's 0 to 10 is pretty understandable for most people. Like 0 is rest, 10's as hard as you can go. 3 to 4 is kind of like, oh yeah, I'm pretty cruisy. 5s and 6s, like, yeah, it's getting a bit hard. And then 7s, 8 and 9s, it's like you should be working pretty hard. So if you're working off that scale, like how are you feeling right now at the end of that stage? And that simple question is a really interesting one because those who don't have too much, I guess, knowledge sometimes actually get a little bit more accurate with their assessment of that because they go, oh yeah, this feels pretty easy still. Whereas those who've done a heap of work, sometimes they go, oh, this feels easy, but I know I'm going to blow up 10K in because that's what's happened in the past. So it's interesting how that dynamic works, but that subjective information is just as important for me. Because on paper, like, lactate numbers could look unbelievable. Like, I could have someone in the lab who's got arguably the most, again, depending how you're looking at it, elite lactate data. Like, in theory, most people would probably think of that as just the lowest numbers possible. But you could take someone who's got super, super low lactate, and on paper, I'm like, they don't look like they're really starting to hurt yet. But you ask them, oh, how are you feeling? And they're like, oh, it's a 7 out of 10. The lactate's 1.5. And it's like, well, how does that match up? Well, we can then dig deeper and go, well, why are you feeling that way? So is it a lactate tolerance thing? Maybe, maybe not. Is it like a leg conditioning thing? Is it a muscle fatigue that you're feeling? How are they running? Like, are they moving in a really awkward way that's causing them maybe pain somewhere else, and that's the symptom that they're feeling. So it's not a difficult intensity, it's the fact that they're in maybe pain or discomfort. Like, that subjective information is so critical to then map up with the objective stuff. But yeah, coming back to the original question around, like, how do we simplify it? Like, 3 zones are a really simple way to look at it, but I always have described it is try for athletes coming into the lab, it's like, try and understand the key parts of your physiology, because then if you know what your lactate threshold 1, what your lactate threshold 2 is and what they mean, and then you know what your VO2 max is for the most part, you can apply pretty much those 3 points to any training zone system available. You just need to know those 3 points and what they are, and then you need to know your system really well. There's different versions of 5 zone. There's the ones where it's like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, A, B, C. Like, that is all great. It doesn't make a difference at the end of the day. It's just what makes sense for you and or your coach and the way you just describe or plan training sessions. But the important part is, like, within all of those, the commonalities are the key pillars of your physiology. Like, where are those 2 thresholds and where's your VO2 max? If you know where those sit, well, everything else just slots into place. Like, if you want to break a zone, instead of having from first threshold all the way to second threshold, so in a 3 zone system, that would be zone 2. Some people want to break that into a specific tempo only zone, so like a 3A, and then like a sub threshold zone of a 3B, and then a threshold zone of a 3C that's kind of like that final little bit plus a bit over threshold. Like, cool. Like, as long as you understand where all of that sits within your set of numbers, or where your numbers sort of align to that philosophy or method, like, that's the important thing, because then you'll still get the most out of your training if you have 15 zones as someone else would if they had 3. It's just what then makes sense in your context, how you process the data, how you process understanding the zones and your training setup.
Just finishing off the little bit of sciencey bit, grey zone gets thrown out a fair bit as well. Is that zone 2? Is that a waste? Is zone 2 different to grey zone? What is that term that people often might hear, and where does that sit in the science?
Well, for most people, it's zone 2 in a 3 zone system, and it's zone 3 in a 5 zone system. And this is where I can fully appreciate how hard it gets for people when they're like, you open up Instagram, or if you open up like TikTok or something, you search zone 2. Most people are referring to zone 2 in a 5 zone context. Whereas, like, when we talk about like these thresholds and that, I guess, Norwegian method, if you like, of 3 zone, it's like, well, we'd actually be referring to zone 1 there. Like, so again, it's just understanding where those thresholds sit. I mean, from a grey zone context, it's often that area between your first and second lactate threshold. It's like the intensity's up enough that you're like, this is comfortably uncomfortable, is a good way to describe it. For most amateurs out there, it's going to be like your half marathon, like your hour 20 through to hour 40 kind of half marathoner. It's sort of that intensity. I can hold this for a good period of time. I know at some point I'm going to fatigue, but right now in the immediate 20, 30, 40 minutes, like, it's manageable. Like, it doesn't feel too different to a pretty easy or solid endurance run. Has its time and place, like any training session. Like, if you're someone who exclusively does low intensity aerobic base work, there is going to be a time and place for you to do some really hard, high intensity stuff to try and manipulate a different part of your engine. Same too for if you exclusively follow that 80-20 polarized model of I do only long and slow, I don't touch any of this grey zone, and I exclusively do top end. If you go and try and run a half marathon, like, you're missing the point. Like, your half marathon pace is going to be somewhere in between. You probably at some point in time want to do some specificity around that pace. Every part of your physiology is going to have its part to play. It's just then, well, how do you structure that across a training block or a training year to get the most out of it? Was it definition of insanity? It's like, do the same thing again and again, you end up with the same results. Like, if all you did was long and slow stuff, like, and your goal is to try and increase your FTP 40 watts, at some point you're going to have to ride hard. Like, if you want to run a 5-minute K pace marathon, at some point you're going to have to run at 5-minute K pace. You can't run 6-minute K pace forever.
And some of these terms can sometimes be dangerous, because the grey zone, I feel like, got recoined from the junk mile area of everyone doing this zone. They're not going to improve because they're sort of doing the same thing all the time. And then again, it's time and place. It depends on the athlete. It depends on what they're preparing for.
Well, I think where it also stems is that, like, because it's that in between. So below the first lactate threshold, where you're like, oh, cool, most people are like happy with doing that. It's easy enough that we're not really accumulating this excessive amount of fatigue. Like you can kind of run and ride that zone, and as long as you balance the recovery out, like you can accumulate heaps of volume. If you're above that second one, it's like we're really pushing a VO2 max stimulus. So it's like, well, what does this middle ground actually mean? It's not hard. It's not always hard enough to elicit a really top end response, but it's probably too hard that you accumulate a bit too much fatigue, and that's why it kind of gets this grey zone nickname. Is it does sort of sit in the middle, but it's highly race specific. So at some point you got to do it, but that's where I guess people sort of jumped on that bandwagon of like, well, if I can do the long easy stuff a bit easier, like, yeah, makes perfect sense, right? Why would I go any harder than I have to if it means I can accumulate more Ks in a week if I push it into zone 1, into 3 zone? Or if I'm really trying to push a VO2 max response, like sometimes it's just not hard enough to push that, so I'm going to have to get out there. Like, yeah, cool, if that's what you're aiming for. But if you're aiming to, in an 8-week block, like if you've got, well, as we sit now, it's like what, Canberra Marathon's not too far off, Ballarat Marathon's not too far off in April. Like, if you're coming into that phase now, 8 or so weeks out, you probably want to do some very marathon-specific running, and pending how fast you are, that actually might mean a good chunk of running just above that first threshold to accumulate some really specific time there. So it becomes really, really relevant. Was it relevant 3 months ago when you're just building a general aerobic fitness to get you as fit as you can to handle that block? Probably not. But this next 8 weeks, it's super, super specific. So that's all just really down to the timing. I think, like, yeah, obviously the social media sort of wave of training over the last, 5-10 years, it's like people jump on terms and sort of bash different training methods, and it's all very nice and flashy when you talk about it that way. But you just have to look at it holistically and go, well, what are we trying to achieve out of this training block, and what part of our physiology do we need to tap into to try and access that improvement, and not just stick to, it's grey zone, so I'm never going to do it. It's like, well, it's a really reductive way to look at your training.
Certainly has a time and place, especially if you're looking at the sort of events that we typically look at, which being your marathon, your half Ironman, your Ironman, that sort of stuff. You definitely need to get specific, and you definitely need to do the training in those areas so you are ready for the race. If you're going to be going out and doing 3-minute intervals, doing that 20 and then going to go do an Ironman, you're not going to really prepare to be doing that 4 or 5 hours on the bike to be able to then run a marathon. You need to be specific for that event. We've talked a lot about the physiology, what's happening with the body. Curious to know where psychology sits in terms of that space. A lot of your testing is what's happening with the body. Does that show up at all? Like if you have someone that comes in and may have a massive VO2, does the psychology of the athlete, e.g. if they've never done any sort of testing before and they haven't learned to push themselves to the limit of, I'm about to throw up and fall off the back of this treadmill.
Or in the reverse, don't have the mental capability to push themselves hard enough. Like that's probably actually more what I see.
Yeah. Does that show up in the testing? Like their ability to be able to push themselves to the max? Do you see that? And then I guess the question then for you is, how do we help athletes improve, well, I guess that's my job, improve their psychology so they do get the most out of their physiology as well? Yeah,
it's sort of interesting. You sometimes get it a bit both. You'll get athletes who don't know where that limit is. So those are probably the lower end, like someone who's relatively new to a triathlon or a marathon running. Like we've seen it, not all the time, but we see it every so often. They'll get through the test and it's really clear they just don't have the psychological capability to push hard enough in a test to really get the top end result. Like it's quite obvious in their data. It's like there was more in the tank, but you probably just gave up a bit early. But part of that isn't necessarily a negative. It's just them understanding, well, there is more to give. Like they've just never tried it before, right? Like if you've never tested, or maybe you're new to running and all you've ever done is just go out and just try and run 3 times a week. Like that's what I would tell most people who've never run before. Like just go out and run a few times. Like it doesn't matter how fast or slow it is. Just like get some consistency running. Then we can worry about the fancy stuff. Like, yeah, you're not going to know how hard you can push at VO2 max if you've never done it. So like there's that end. So unlocking and a really positive side of like, yeah, you've got more to give and being really positive. Then there's the other end of those who really do know how to bury themselves. Sometimes it's also more about then reeling them back in. And that's what I have found probably more so with a handful of the really elite and pro guys at times is you don't have to go that hard all the time. Like it's okay just because you're racing at the top end of the sport. It's still okay to go run a 5-minute K pace. Like, which for context, a lot of amateur runners will be like, I'd love to run a 5-minute K pace. But like for some of these guys, when we're talking half marathons off the bike, you look at the 70.3 field, right? Most of the guys who are competitive are running sub 115, almost low one, like 110, 109. half marathons. It's like they're running ridiculously quick paces, but throughout their training week, like it's okay for them to go and run at a much slower pace than what they think. Like some of them can run easily at 4:30, 4-minute pace as well. Do they have to? No. So part of their psychology would be like reeling them back in, because does that mean they can access more training in the week? Like, look at some of the numbers that they're doing. Like the guys who are averaging 28, 30, 32, 35 hours of training a week at that very, very pointy end. Is it sustainable for some of them? No. And part of that might actually be that intensity regulation. If they think they're going easy, but on paper, it's like you could have actually gone even easier so that you can do 3, 4, 5 months continuously of this rather than 6 weeks. I get sick and injured, burnt out because I've been pushing a bit too hard. So it works, I guess, in both directions, but the psychology is key. And that's probably something I've learned more so definitely through the sports science part. And like you sort of consider that as another aspect of that, I guess, sports science, sport performance field is the sports psychology piece, but probably more so in the umpiring side of things is where I've learned a lot of that importance of psychology. The most important thing for us is then the decision-making thing on that aspect. And like, that's all mental. Like I can be as fit as I like, but if I can't make really clear, accurate decisions in a very short period of time based on the information I've got in front of me, like I'm going to struggle on field performance-wise. I personally sort of look at it and go, much easier for a triathlete to make some of those decisions because like you're out on course and there's not as much going on, but there's some critical decisions. Like, do I go with that group in front that's sort of taken off a bit harder than what I thought, or do I hold back and race my own race? Like, you got to make those calls, and that's all above the shoulders, based on your experience, based on your training, based on what you know about the situation. How many times have you seen in open water starts someone go off in a really weird, obscure direction, and you're like, gee, that seems like a risky call, and then all of a sudden they come back in. It's like that was a great decision, but sometimes they get it horribly wrong, and they've just lost 10, 15, 20 seconds potentially of time. So like this all comes back to how an athlete's mind's ticking over. And then there's also just the management of how you're going with training. Like it's not always going to be a perfect training week, is it? Like you probably know this as well. It's like you sometimes have weeks where you're like, I'm just not feeling it. Like it's not going well. But knowing how to get through that from a mental perspective is key. Like if you can work through some strategies to keep you on track, accept that it's not maybe a perfect training block, but if you stack multiple training blocks on top of each other, at some point it will come back the other way. Like that's the ebbs and flows of performance. It's all above the shoulders. Like you get through that period, it's like you'll get some really good results off the back of it. The athletes who struggle, that's where it's like you get so deep into it to a point where you stop training. Like, well, you're not going to get the results if you stop training. So we've got to find ways to keep you on track up top.
I certainly want to explore the psychology a little bit more. Just through all that, I was thinking about Sam Lalo and his decision around not wearing a wetsuit at one of the T100 races. Obviously, being a very strong swimmer, he has the ability to keep himself within distance, but he made a decision to not wear a wetsuit to make sure that his body temp didn't go over to the point where he couldn't come back from. I think you started to do some testing now around heat and its impact on the other systems and how to maximize performance. What are you seeing in terms of that now becoming a focus and being able to get the most out of our performance as well? And where does that sort of sit for the everyday person as well?
Yeah, I think it's this snowball of the more the sports, the endurance sports in particular, develop, the more technology we get, the more insights we have. Traditionally, if you want to look at your core body temperature, you have to swallow a temperature pill or have something shoved up an area that you probably don't want to have.
Which changes as well, because where it is in the body, the temperature's going to change.
But like now with a core temp sensor, like you can have that strapped to the side of your body. You get a really good idea. I mean that technology itself will evolve over time to be more and more accurate. But like in that specific case, like the overheating piece is critical. Like it doesn't take much for you to tip over relative to you what would be considered overheating. I mean, everyone's body temperature is slightly different at rest. Everyone's body temperature is going to be slightly different during activity and during their performance itself or in the race. And I guess in his circumstance, I don't know the numbers behind it, but if they thought it was clearly worthwhile for him not to swim in a wetsuit to maintain a temperature and not lose too much, as you said, it's like be able to still stay with most of the pack. If he can make up that time as a result of having not overheated in the swim,
which he did, yeah,
perfect. The counter argument would be, it's like, well, if you're someone who's maybe not a strong swimmer, like Sam Long probably isn't going to go no wetsuit in a PTO race because he's already out the back. But like in his circumstance, it's like, it's just not worth it. Like, let's just try and find a cooling strategy. So is it changing brand of wetsuit? Is it changing the buoyancy of that wetsuit or the thickness to try and get something that is a little bit cooler? Is going a sleeveless wetsuit a better option to try and release some heat? Like, you have options, but
which I'm surprised some haven't gone to
well,
sleeveless to try and minimize some of that heat while still getting some of that buoyancy back.
well,
Like,
then it's that whole thing of like the material of the wetsuit through your arm. Like, is that actually going to give you better interaction with the water? So are you swimming significantly faster with less energy cost, and does that heat help keep your internal heat production down? I mean, like, that side of the sport, absolutely critical. But then even like we touched on psychology before, but like something like heat can be a really strong one in terms of psychology too. Like, if you just feel hot, you start feeling a bit anxious, you start feeling a bit more stressed than normal, you start making some poor decisions as a result, you get a bit rattled. Like, that's the flow-on effect, right? So if you're able to find ways to keep yourself cooler and use some of that data relative to you of, okay, I know in these circumstances, X, Y, and Z, I'm going to start getting a bit hot. What are my active cooling strategies? All right, in the water, I can't change the water temp. Like, that's fixed. I can't change my wetsuit at that time. I can't tip ice on me because I've got nothing around. Okay, my only option would be swim in something that's not going to it's not going to be as hot for me. And I guess that's the case that we're sort of dealing with there. But yeah, definitely that cooling side of things, critical. Like, overheat, things start shutting down. You get to a critical enough point where you can't cool yourself down enough, and ultimately, body just stops. A great example of that was, if you think back to the Gold Coast Commonwealth Games, was that 2010 maybe, with the Scottish guy? I think it was Callum Hawkins maybe. I want to get that name right, but
I would have done my research if you knew.
Anyway, it was a while ago. So Scottish guy comes out, runs a marathon at Com Games. He's absolutely flying out the front, but he grew up in Scotland. He trained in Scotland. He's in a cold environment, comes to the Gold Coast. It wasn't that hot, but it was hot, like high 20s from memory. Gets like 5 or 6K from the end and just collapses, hits the deck. And a lot of that is going to be, in the times that they're running, probably not going to be excessive fuel depletion because they'd be topping themselves up. They'd be well aware of that. Hydration-wise, maybe, because he was probably sweating a bit more than normal, but given those hotter conditions than he's used to. But I reckon a lot of that just came down to his ability to cool himself down. He just wasn't prepared enough. And this is where guys are going and doing sauna work, heat training. The pros will go to Kona a month before the race to get themselves acclimatized. Like, I'm sure he did some of those things, but at the end of the day, the thing that got him would have been that heat load stress. And you can see the result is he goes from gold medal position in a really comfortable lead, 5Ks from the line, to DNFing the race, lying on the side of the ground, pretty much fainted as a result of just getting far too hot. Because that process of overheating to shut down can happen quite quickly. So it's a super relevant point when we talk about performance, especially long distance.
And how much can someone prepare for something like that? So for those of us in Melbourne who in May, June, it's going to be cold, going up to Cairns where it's going to be very humid and the body's not great for cooling itself down in humidity. It's a lot better in the dry heat. For an event like that, or for those who are coming from, again, Melbourne, Tassie, going to Kona where it's going to be particularly hot, how much can you prepare the body for conditions like that? Maybe if he had done a little more preparation, he would have done a lot better Gold Coast.
Yeah, I don't know his exact background in terms of how long he spent on the Gold Coast before the competition, but I mean, as you can imagine, with some of those athletes in sports that aren't massively funded, and I mean or even athletes who aren't amateur athletes, it's like most amateurs probably aren't going to Kona 4 to 6 weeks before to do heat acclimation. I mean, if you've got the funds and time to do it, great. But and this is where the top end pros will do it. But even some of the lower ranked pros, they probably just can't afford to do it. So like there's a trade off there. That would be the optimal scenario. So if we're looking at, let's take Cairns Ironman as a great example. It's probably going to be hot. It's going to be reasonably high humidity compared to Melbourne. You're coming out of middle of winter, so it's cold here. What are your options? Your options are to go up there a good amount of time in advance. I mean, 3 to 4 weeks would be ideal. Most of your acclimation, though, the vast majority, I think it's about 80 or 90%, will happen in the first 4 or so days. So even if you can get there a week before, you're still ahead of someone who's getting there on the Friday for racing on Sunday, in terms of that heat acclimation. In terms of then trying to simulate that, there's some things you can do. I mean, sauna use is a really effective one. I tend to recommend, if you want a simple strategy of that, is most people are going to public pools that probably have a sauna. Get in, get your swim sets done for the week, if you're a triathlete in this case. Swim sets done for the week, get straight out of the water, straight into the sauna. I mean, there's different protocols that you can follow there, but at a public sauna, kind of as hot as you can get it. I mean, a lot of the research would be quite high temperatures. You'd probably most people probably read it being like, how are you surviving in 80-degree temperatures? But they're very controlled protocols. Most public saunas might only go to 30, 35, especially when people open and shut the door every 2 minutes. But get into a sauna immediately after your swims a couple of times a week is better than doing nothing. You can do your heat prep stuff if you've got something like a core sensor. They've set up some really nice protocols. They've got them on their website of like how to implement some of that heat training strategy at home, like overdressing indoor, turn the heaters on. One that I've done for a number of years and I've picked up from athletes over the years, if you've got the space to do it, even like a room so that we're in this size, it's like if you've got a bathroom big enough or a laundry big enough or something equivalent, or you know someone who has one, turn the dryer on for a bit, steam the room up a bit, or turn the shower on, steam it up, turn a heater on, and do a trainer set in there. Like, it doesn't have to be hard. Like, it might just be a solid endurance, sort of 5-zone system, top zone 2. But for an hour and a half, but in that climate, like, that's going to get you as close as you can. It's never going to be perfect. But, I mean, there's a few little strategies you can work with. Any way to get your body more comfortable with an elevated temperature compared to what it is normally. You don't need to do it every session, but like a couple of sessions in a week, 3-4 sessions in a week over a couple of week period leading into the race would be useful. There's a number of different ways you can mix and match that, but I find those are probably the most practical for people who are like, I'm on a pretty strict budget, I want to get up and race. Yes, I can get there a few days before when I'm a bit limited, but then sometimes you just get there and it's like those 3 or 4 days before are really cool, and then race day's hot. So like, you can't really plan it too well, but that's where the bonus of like, if you could get there a month before, it's ideal, right?
Yeah. I think just the last question for today, we're still seeing records being broken. I think we just saw the half marathon record getting broken. We're starting to see age groupers now performing basically times in Ironman and half Ironman in running events where they're pretty close to what they used to be for professional athletes. Yep. Where do you see sports performance going, and how much of that do you think currently is coming around from us now having more access to lab testing? It's the training from the coaching, it's coming from the psychology. Where do you think is the biggest areas for us to grow as athletes?
I think in terms of areas of growth, definitely on the psychological side of things, I think you just have to look in general health terms. Like, we're far more aware of mental health and well-being now than we ever were. So like, making sure that athletes are actually managing these training loads really well and enjoying what they're doing, I think is a key part of it. But I think the other thing we probably also just haven't seen yet, or we're starting to see, is athletes who've been doing really good things from a very young age. If you go back to what I guess the pros were doing in the 80s and 90s, you think about the times that we're doing there, but you think about the 15 or 20 years to get to those times of training before that. It's like training's evolved massively since the 70s or 80s. And each sort of, I guess, couple of decade phase, we're going to see probably continuing improvement for a little, maybe the next little while in particular. But think about those who are coming on the scene now, like some of your 22, 23-year-olds winning 70.3 world champs and super young, but like the training that they started when they were 8, 9, 10, and the methodology behind it, and I guess the research that has gone into developing those kind of methods is what the pros were using kind of at that time, but they've just had the bonus of being able to do it from such a young age. So I think that also plays into it in terms of what we're seeing performance-wise now. Like Ingebrigtsen, for example, I think, did he break the indoor mile and the 1500 world record in the same race?
Same race.
Like, you think about the Norwegian setups, like all of what they developed around cross-country skiing over decades of dominance. It's like they've taken all of that, packaged it as this nice Norwegian method, and then he's been able to reap the benefits of it from a very young age and learning that system and training to that system. Yes, he's a genetically gifted athlete as well, but like he's reaping the reward of that now, and we're seeing these amazing performances. It's like the Norwegian athletes, or even those runners he's breaking those records of 10 years ago, but then also the 10 years before that when they were growing up and developing, just didn't have that potential, more than likely didn't have that same support or, I guess, process to their athletic development. So I think that's where you're still going to see maybe not anything wild in terms of development. Yes, there's shoe design and skin suits and aerodynamics and all those little things that play into these different sports, but and all the fancy stuff we like to look at, but the fundamentals of like athletes just doing things better from a younger age. Like looking after their mental health and well-being better from a younger age, and developing positive psychological coping mechanisms from a younger age to handle the pressures of performing at these big events. I mean, like all of that, it can't be underestimated. Like I even look at some of the young kids who come through, who might be getting scouted for college scholarships or training, things like that. Some of the numbers they put out, I'm like, yeah, that's like pretty impressive. But then just the way they think about their performance and talk about what they're doing nutrition wise. Like I had a young dad and his young kid come in. He's like a combat sort of fighter, 15, 16. He's sort of developing in that space. And the way he described his day-to-day nutrition, like in and around school hours, I was like, I wasn't thinking that at 15. But like the kids and the younger athletes coming through are just so much more driven in terms of nailing those 1%ers. Like go back almost 15 years to when I was 15. But like I was conscious of that stuff and like aware, but not to anywhere near that level. And so I think as time goes on, you're going to see that play out with just that better support around these developing athletes, that by the time they get to that elite level, like it's going to really show from a performance perspective. I don't think anything has drastically changed. Like no one's necessarily doing anything revolutionary. Yes, there's some innovation still happening, but you think about the Norwegian method as being like one of the benchmarks of what people look at as a training methodology. That hasn't changed for decades. Like they've been doing that for a long, long time. Like the fundamentals are still the same. We're just getting smarter at distributing that across all right, let's take a 12-year-old right at the start and let's build them for 8 or 9 years first. By the time they're 20, yes, they're at world-class level. By the time they're 23, they're winning. And that's kind of the model they're sort of working off. But having all of the knowledge of the previous 30, 40, 50 years behind them to start that versus someone back in the day. It's like, yeah, you look at those Ironman times from the early 2000s in the pro field and you're like, there's guys in their 50s doing that now. It's just a very different sort of setup.
I certainly think they're all contributing factors. You know, the science, the lab, the psychology, the nutrition, all of them are contributing factors for improvement. I think it's interesting you mentioning about the youth and the psychology and how focused they are on all of those contributing factors. I do think in terms of our youth and the generation coming through, because I remember pre-technology and how much it's impacted us, and I do think technology has impacted us in a way is negative. Generally speaking, I think a lot of people need to disconnect to a certain degree from a lot of it, just getting out, going for a run, connecting with nature, all those sorts of things. And I think a lot of people would improve from disconnecting a little bit, as even in terms of top-end athletes, spending time without the watch and just enjoying and connecting with the body. For those who enjoyed today's episode, Nick does have his own podcast, Physiology Secrets. Is that correct?
Yeah, which we unfortunately haven't posted on in a long time. But there's plenty of really good episodes.
Now we can just throw this one on there, so it's an update. So Nick, thank you for coming on the show. Until next time, dream big, take action, and enjoy the journey.